I do not ask for the sun and moon from your sky, your farm, your land, your high houses or your mansions. I do not ask for gods or rituals or castes, or even your mother, sisters, daughters. I ask for my rights as a man. These lines are taken from Sharan Kumar Limbali's White Paper. These are the lines which talk about the plights of the Dalits who crave for being acknowledged for their rights of for being given their rights as human beings. Welcome to today's session on The Poison Bread by Bandhu Madhav. Bandhu Madhav was a Dalit short story writer from the Mahar community in Maharashtra, and he was a Buddhist convert. He wrote extensively during the 1940s and 50s. He was also instrumental in founding the Little Magazine movement, which blended modernism and the Dalit movement. He did this along with Babu Rao Bagul and Shankar Rao Kharat. Bandhu Madhav was also a leading writer of Prabhuddha Bharat and Dharmayana. Certain characteristic features of his writings include immense loathing for injustice, intense compassion for the oppressed, a profound dislike and contempt for old tradition and practices rooted in religion. He wrote all that he and his ancestors witnessed, experienced, and suffered in a sincere and fearless manner through his stories. His stories are not formed solely in his imagination. Instead, they materialize out of real Dalit lives. Let's just take a look at the caste system in India and then move into the text. Indian society is a composition of caste. The ancient Dharma Shastras or religious texts of Hindus mentions the existence of four varnas or four classes: the Brahmins or the priests, the Kshatriyas or the warriors, the Vaishyas or the traders, and the Shudras or the menial job doers. This hierarchical class and caste system is an occurrence which had gained authorization in the Hindu texts written by Brahmins. These religious texts elaborated upon the fact that class system was God's decree and not man's verdict. It said that it was the propaganda of the it is said that it was the propaganda of the Brahmins that they were born out from the mouth of Brahma. The Kshatriyas were born from his shoulders, the Vaishyas from his thighs, and the Shudras from his feet. And it was following this theory of human origin in Hindu texts that the Brahmins assumed the superior position among the castes. It needs mention that such theories were inscribed in the Rig Veda, which was held to be God's creation. This accounts for a transformation uh, of the Dalits. When it came to the Dalit Reformation movement, we see that a lot of Dalits changed their religion from Hinduism to Buddhism because Hinduism believed in such a kind of division of people based on their ancestry. Now, looking at the word Dalit. The word Dalit is a 20th century construct. According to the earlier religious hierarchy, we find that Brahmins enjoyed privilege of being the superiormost, and the Dalits were not allowed any social, economic, or civic rights, and they were forced into social and physical exclusion. And after a point of time, this kind of exclusion made them hostile and against the society. So, this word Dalit itself is infused with a lot of effort for propagating a common history and identity. The Dalit situation had gone through much discrimination and oppression in respect to property rights, and its concept and principles justified exploitation, servitude, misery, and the religious doctrines. And it can be very easily identified that the Brahmins in the society did not want to defy the social hierarchy. They wanted to perpetuate the act of deliberate exploitation under the pretext of God's creation. And as a result, the Dalits could never perceive their real persecutors. The doctrine which was abided by the Indian society was theory of karma, according to which Dalits can also achieve salvation and improve behavior from higher caste with devotion towards one's duty. So, even in the story that we are going to see, we see that Yatalya Aja, the grandfather, thinks a lot about the karma that he is doing. He wants to do whatever is assigned to him, and that too faithfully, in spite of all the humiliation and the oppression he has had to face. So, considering all these social oppression and the social conditions faced by the Dalits, there was a point in history when people started a reformation in the society itself. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar was one such person who inspired and revitalized the marginalized and discriminated into a new awakening. The people who belonged to the Dalit community started getting education, and this actually steered uh, these people living in exclusion towards a new direction. And Dalit literature itself is an effort to not only portray the Dalit situation, but also to protest against the stigma of the society. Dalit literature may not always affirm the Dalithood, rather portray instances which will show them identifying the real enemy. This story, The Poison Bread, is also a literary piece which offers a picture of the plight of people trapped in the ills um, of the caste system. We find that the condition of Dalits is strongly featured in the story, and the author has tried to evoke a Dalit consciousness in the Maha family in the story. So, as the story begins, we find that uh, the narrator, who is a small boy, Madhava, uh, the narrator in his adulthood reflects back on this incident from his childhood. And this is how it starts. Come harvest time, with everyone busy winnowing and sifting, where the birds whirl in the sky, my heart bleeds like a wounded bird as I recall the bygone harvest of 12 years ago when I had gone to meet my grandfather Yedalya Aja at Kupad. So it is a flashback. It's a story that is narrated in a flashback technique. So the author, as he looks back 12 years in his life, he thinks of a similar harvest time when he had a major loss in his life, the death of his grandfather Yedalya Aja. He talks about the situations that led to this particular condition. So, as the story begins, we find that there is an exposition of characters. We find that the characters Yathalya Aja, Bapu Patil, Mahadeva, that is the narrator, the small boy in the story. So, all these characters are introduced. And as the story progresses, we find that there is a rising action. There is a conflict between Bapu Patil, the landowner, and Mahadeva. So Bapu Patil is continuously intense at humiliating Grandpa Yetalya or Yetalya Aja and his grandson Madeva. So from the time he meets, we find Yetalya Aja so humble towards Bapu Patil. He says that he has come begging uh, for the day's food, but then Bapu Patil he is so determined to humiliate them, and he says and he condemns Yetalya and Mahadeva based on certain Dalits' actions for their social improvement. He says that you are all you consider yourself to be equals to us, so you have even started claiming equality. So now that you're our peers, do you need to beg for a share of corn? So Babu Patil asks all this in a tone of contempt, and Grandpa Yetalya feels that okay, this is not going to work well today. And later we find that there is a conflict arising between Bapu Patil and Madeva because seeing Grandpa Yetalya begging and falling at the feet of Bapu Patil, Madeva, his grandson, feels irritated. He feels agitated. He speaks back to Patil. He calls Bapu Patil by his name. Usually, the Dalits, they or the Mahas, they called the landowners by a particular greeting called they call them Anna, or they call them some. They address them with some kind of respectable names. But here we see Madeva, the small boy, addressing him by his name Patil, and Bapu Patil is so enraged. He is filled with fury. So he even he even puts certain blames on the Dalits, saying that they have polluted the religion and they have abandoned the caste and they have polluted certain gods and all. And finally, we find that Bapu Patil lets them work, but he is strongly determined that he would not give them their share of corn for that day's work. So, Yatalya and Madeva are put to work. Meanwhile, Grandpa Yatalya says that he would go to Gyanba Patil's threshing floor to fetch a tripod and a few measures of corn. And the boy, Madeva, was asked to stand there to stay back and clean up the threshing floor. And Madeva, the narrator, says that he has been working hard. That's when Bapu Patil comes and makes fun of him and asks where his grandpa Yetilya is. And grandpa Yetilya, after a long time, comes panting for breath, and he brings a tripod from Gyanba Patil's threshing floor. Once they are back there, Bapu Patil continues his humiliation. Bapu Patil tells him that he would not give him that day's wages in the form of food. Grandpa is so disturbed. Grandpa tells Madheva that this has happened because of his talking back to Bapu Patil. And Madheva replies, saying that even a lion locked in a cage all his life forgets how to hunt. And he feels that it is high time that the Dalits uh, stopped this kind of submissive attitude towards the upper caste people, and that they need to work independently if they had to live a decent enough life. So, on the way back to their home, we find that Grandpa collects certain rotten bread from the uh, from the pen near Bapu Patil's house, and those bread are 4 days old, 4 or 5 days old. They are rotten, and they start emitting foul smell. But even then, Grandpa is so happy picking them up, thinking that this would this would be enough to feed the house for a day. So he collects all that. On the way, he cleans them up, and when he reaches his home, he gives it to Madeva's grandma. And that night, they all have the food along with their particular dish called fuli. And they, sorry, in particular dish called duli. And they have food, and that night, we see Grandpa Yetalia has a severe vomiting. He is seen to be writhing in pain, and uh, when the doctor comes, doctor says that this is food poisoning, and he tells Grandpa Yetalia that the food, the bread, has turned into poison. And it is at this point that Grandpa Yatalia tells Madeva that it is high time that the Dalits uh, got rid of this poison bread and started earning for themselves, started earning a decent enough life for themselves. So that is the a basic outline of the story. There are three main characters in the story. One is Yetalia Aja, the grandfather of the narrator. He works for daily wages, and his daily work is equivalent to begging because they do a lot of hard work, but what they get in reward is not money or any kind of wages, but it is some food that they obtain from the threshing floor. So, as the story begins, we find Grandpa Yetalia going in search of the job of winnowing and treading out the corn at the threshing floor. He is seen to be extremely submissive. He is passively accepting everything that the caste system has enforced upon their particular group. And he keeps saying, I am your slave to Bapu Party. So this Mahar, this old Mahar, is subjected to long subjugation at the hands of the upper caste. But he is never distressed at his condition, and he consigns himself to his fate and existence. Far removed from aspirations, he is submerged in his state with no voice of dissent. He would have made his grandson Madeva to assist him in this job of winnowing and treading at the thrashing floor. Incidentally, we find that Madeva, the narrator, his grandson, he comes from Sangalwadi and he's had education. His grandson is city bred and has tasted education. The Dalits live a life of marginalization, and being ostracized is a stigma for the society. That is why Bapu Patil pronounces that a sight of Yetalia Aja, the Dalit, in the early part of the day will invite evil events to his life. But Yetalia Aja shows no resistance for this insult on him. We find that there is also another instance where Bapu Patil puts a lot of blames on the Mahas. He says that the Mahas have profaned religion. He says that they have defiled Lord Vidobha. Rain God got encouraged. Rain God got enraged because of these Mahas' doings. So he humiliates and treats Yatalia and Madeva really badly. And it is impossible for him to conceive the idea of equality for all the castes. He says that they are all trying to be equals, and they did not need to beg the corn from the upper caste people. So he humiliates them. And finally, we see that he says that he has a lot of contempt for the Mahar being educated. And Babu Patil says that even if a Mahar or a monk gets educated, no one will call him a Brahmin. Mahar is a Mahar, even if he passes LLB and becomes a barrister. So, though Madeva, the narrator, attempted to, speak back to Bapu Patil, we find that he is finally given in to the fate that his grandfather has had to bear with. The streak of revolt seems to be strong in Madeva, and he tried to protect his grandfather. But what happens is, in spite of all the speaking back, in spite of all their attempts, they're still back to that submissive plane in the society. And towards the end, we find a voice of helplessness from Yetalia Aja. That is exactly the reason why he says that he also wanted to retaliate and he wanted to have a good fight for the humiliation and injustice of injustice that is piling upon us. And he says, "But my boy, I am helpless. I see no end to this suffering." And then before his death, Grandpa tells his grandson that you should never depend on the age old bread associated with our caste, because this poisonous bread will finally kill the very humanness of man. That's how he dies. He dies by saying these words: this poisonous bread will finally kill the very humanness of man. So it is about the story is altogether about this one incident in Mahadeva's and Grandpa Yethalya's life, which ultimately resulted in Grandpa Yethalya's death. So the story overall talks about the plight, the condition of Dalits in an Indian society, and how Dalits are being treated, and how their desire to revolt and resist all these kinds of treatments go in vain usually. So, as we conclude, we need to understand that The Poisoned Bread is a story of an awakened but suppressed Dalit consciousness, and it presents dissenting voices against the upper class domination and exploitation. It shows how education has empowered a new generation of Dalits to reclaim their legitimate space in a caste ridden society that continues to diminish them. Madeva, who is indifferent to custom, addresses the upper caste landlord Bapu Patil as Patil and despises his grandfather's subservience to him. But Patil, on his part, continues to humiliate the two. They are denied their just wages or their meager share of corn, and they are forced in the end to feed on stale, dung smeared, poisoned bread. While this degradation ultimately takes the life of his grandfather, he dies with the realization that his true Dalit identity is not one of slavishness, but of reclaiming his rights as a human being. This struggle is the legacy he leaves for his grandson Madeva, invoking the future of the Dalit movement. We also find that there are two symbols in this work. The first symbol is that of a bird. That's how the story begins. The birds whirl in the sky. My heart bleeds like a wounded bird. The symbol of bird evokes a sense of freedom, but the bird is in a whirling motion and depicts restlessness and agitation, as it is on the wait for a little bit of grain. So, this wait is synonymous to the long wait of the Dalits in a precarious state of life for freedom to fly unhindered and free. Another symbol is the poisoned bread. The poisoned bread becomes a symbol of the, the life that is led by the Dalits. Metaphorically, the food poisoning is the poisonous condition created in the society by the privileged inhabitants. But we find that the last words of Yadalya Aja puts forward a ray of hope, a vision for the Dalits. He says, never depend on the age old dread associated with our caste. Get as much education as you can. Take away this accursed bread from the mouths of Mahas. So, as we conclude, we understand that the passive acceptance and hopelessness was symbolized by the consumption of the poisonous bread. The realization that these would not only save them from being victimized, but also steer the society towards a necessary tradition of tolerance and acceptance for Dalits and would help them to achieve their rights. So, the tradition of social exclusion needs to be challenged to save humanness. So, that is basically a look into The Poisoned Bread by Bandhu Madhav. And thank you so much for listening.